Greetings, heroes. It is I, your friendly neighborhood Rabbi John Carrier, and I'm here tonight. It is the week where our Torah portion this week is Parashat Vayakhel. This is an interesting time of year, I guess, or rather an interesting year of the times of years, because this is a leap year. And why that's interesting, at least to me, is that many years, most years, I'll say, the slim majority of years, regular years, there are about 50 weeks in the lunar year, and we mush together, for lack of a better word, parshiot. So especially when we get to the ends of books, we like to, if we don't have enough weeks, we'll take two parshiot and smush them together. This Sefer is no exception. So most years, this week's Parsha and next week's Parsha are conjoined. And so it's usually Vayakhel Pekude with a little, hyphenate in there, like somebody's last name, and they got married and they put them together. And so we also have in another book, we have Acharei Mot and Kedoshim. So in this time, it's Vayakhel and Pekude. Most years, they are read on the same week. This year, because we have a leap year, we have an extra month, we have an extra 4 weeks to read the Torah, and so we have 54 full parshiot instead of 50, and so now we can read Vayakhel by itself in its own right. And so one thing that stirred me this week was Shabbat, and you can kind of see that in the live streams that we've been doing. Last night we talked about Shabbat and 4 ways to celebrate it. Tomorrow night we're going to talk about, I think daytime, maybe tomorrow during the daytime, we're going to talk about the blessings for Shabbat, at the traditional blessings for the Shabbat table: candles, wine, washing hands, challah, other blessings that we say. And so I've kind of got Shabbat in the brain, and you'll know why in a second. Before we go there, I just want to pause for a second. Thank everybody for coming. See who is in the live stream this evening. We've got Danielle. I recognize you from yesterday. So great to see you. We have Teresa from Cyprus is in the house. It's probably morning time there. We've got Kathy from California. So great to see everybody in the live stream. And feel free, if you have questions about this Parsha, if you have questions about things that I talk about along the way, feel free to throw those in the chat. If you have questions about Shabbat, like I said, I've kind of got Shabbat on the brain this week, and I'm going a little fast here. There's, I'm sorry, I was just having an argument with somebody on the internet. I don't know if anybody has ever had that happen. It wasn't even an argument. Like, it was just expressing a different opinion from one that had been expressed. And it sort of brings me to my senses. I'm reminded there, I think there was an old New Yorker cartoon where somebody was at their computer and their spouse is calling down to them, it's time to come to bed. And that person said, "I can't come to bed yet, honey. Somebody's wrong on the internet." And so that's sort of a natural human tendency to see disagreements and jump into them when, maybe the kindest thing to do is to just sort of hear somebody out, keep your opinion to yourself. There's that old saying that, if you're silent, people won't. People may think you're a fool. If you're silent, people may think you're a fool. If you open your mouth, they'll know that with certainty. So I probably should have kept my mouth shut. So we'll see how that turns out. In any case, I'm delighted to learn with everybody tonight. Once again, it's me, your friendly neighborhood Rabbi John Carrier. This is a live studio recording of the Jew Curious Show podcast. So be probably sharing this on the podcast in tomorrow's episode. And this is sort of a new thing that we're trying, of live streaming on YouTube, taking questions from the live audience, giving shout outs to people who show up live, and then sharing it with our podcast audience. We've been doing a lot of more podcast interviews lately, had some great guests like Rabbi Brad Hirschfield, Sarah Klegman, historian Jack Wertheimer today. We've got some amazing guests coming up before the end of this week is out. Y'all, it is, I don't know how to introduce this, but I'm just going to say it. Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg is going to be on the Jew Curious Show podcast coming up before the end of this week. If you've seen any rabbis on Twitter, you've seen Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg on Twitter. She, not only engages with people again, engages with people she radically disagrees with, but she does it with grace and with kindness. And she teaches some really amazing Torah on Twitter. So I can't say that about a lot of people, but I'll say it about Friday's guest. So tune into the Jew Curious show on Friday to hear from Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. And she's going to talk about her book. She's got several books out there, but her most recent book is called Nurture the Wow, and it's about the spirituality of parenting. Like she was a spiritual person before she was a parent. She became a parent and then learned a new kind of spirituality, let's say. And I don't want to spoil it for you. She tells it much better than I do. So just tune into that episode. If you haven't seen one of my videos before, just know that I've got about 170 of them out there on various Jewish topics. So I'd love for you to stay for this conversation. Once it's over, or at your convenience, at your leisure, feel free to check out any other video on my channel, see what else we can learn together. And if you'd like to take it a step farther, whether with me or with another rabbi, I have a guide out there for people who want to upgrade their Jewish learning experience. And you can see links to that on this video. You can see links to that at the end of the video or in the show notes for this video. So with that, I want to take a look at the chat, see if anybody else has showed up. We got CJ Mays. I don't know if I've seen this face before. Erev Tov from Delaware. That's awesome. Thank you so much. Welcome for being here, CJ. I've never, ever gotten an Erev Tov from Delaware. So I've got one of my best friends here in town is from Delaware. So I know Delaware people feel very serious about being from Delaware, and I think that's awesome. And so all the more so I'm excited to get an Erev Tov, meaning a good evening from Delaware. So thank you for that. So I want to jump right into it. The reason I've got Shabbat in the brain is that Shabbat kind of inserts itself into this Parsha, into this week's Torah portion. So we've been in Exodus for a little while now. We're actually almost done. Vayakhel is the penultimate Parsha of Exodus. If we were doing Vayakhel and Pekudei together, we'd already be in Leviticus next week. But no, we get to draw it out a little bit. We'll be in Leviticus in 2 weeks. So we're almost done with Exodus, and the back end of Exodus has really been about preparing the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary, if you will, our kind of marching temple, I guess you could say. And we spent a couple of parshiot talking about that, how wonderful it's going to be, all the gold and silver and wood and animal skins and tapestries. Sorry if there are any vegans out there. Apologize. I just teach it. I don't endorse it. So we've got all those wonderful things that are going to happen when we put this sanctuary together. It sort of describes the situation. It's like seeing it on the showroom floor at IKEA or reading the directions, but we haven't put it together yet. Then we go from kind of construction to Fashion Week. We go from Property Brothers to Project Runway, both popular shows in my household. I'm not making fun. I'm probably more Property Brothers, but I'll confess, when Tim Gunn comes out on Project Runway, I am totally with that dude, and I'll watch it too. But then we have a story about a cow, and it doesn't look good on us. We survive. Most of us survive the story of the cow, but the people are sort of missing the intimate, immediate, present contact with God, and the immediate contact that they had with Moses. God and Moses are off together someplace for 40 days and 40 nights. And the people kind of lose heart. When God is not right there, their minds go someplace else. They say, we need another focal point. We need something to worship. And they build a cow. And we almost get killed for it. This is the Chet HaEgel, the sin or the error of the golden calf. And God gets upset. God's about to say, you know what? Just kill all these folks. Start over with Moses. Moses argues with him. It ends well for us. Not dead. Nice thing. And then we get back to business. Then we get back to we go from the plans and the materials list of the Mishkan Now we are talking about actually putting it together. We are hiring the general contractor, as it were, a guy named Betzalel and his assistant, Ohaliav. And these are the guys who are going to direct the building of the Mishkan. Another piece that I really love from this Parsha, I'm not going to go too deep into it right now, but it's about the Nadiv Lev. Right? When they first started talking about putting the Mishkan together, the call went out. God says to Moses, you go tell the folks, bring all sorts of stuff. I'm going to need silver. I'm going to need gold. I'm going to need acacia wood. I'm going to need tapestries. I'm going to need some stuff to build for you to build these things. And but didn't tell anybody how much. Right? It just said whatever your heart inspires you to do. Bring a Nadiv Lev. Right? A heart-inspired donation. And this Parsha, a couple weeks later, brings it home. It says that all the people brought in Nadiv Lev. 3 weeks later, sorry about that. All the people brought in Nadiv Lev. They brought gifts from the heart, and Moses had to stop them. Right? So, okay, stop when people when you tell people what to bring, they'll bring it. Maybe they'll bring most of it. A lot of times, people won't bring more than what you ask for. But when you say, look, I'm not going to tell you how much to bring. You do what's right for you. We are surprised by generosity, right? We are surprised that when people bring things according to how their heart drives them, Moses has to say, wait, we've got too much. Take some of this stuff back. Keep it for yourselves. It's a long trip in the desert. You're going to need a little pocket change from when we stop at the tolls and stuff. So when you let somebody open up their heart, there is abundance, right? If you really try to control everything and specify and you worry that things aren't going to be enough, you're right? If you plan for scarcity, you get scarcity. However, when you plan for abundance, when you trust people, you can often be surprised by how people will over-deliver for you. That's not always true. Sometimes people disappoint you. I'm not an unrealist. I don't know what the right word is for that. I'm not a friar. I'm not a sucker. But I am really impressed by this story. But that's not what I want to talk about tonight. What I want to talk about is Shabbat. So once again, we've got the materials list. We've got a description of the priestly clothing. We have a mild interlude into idolatry, and not a lesson we're going to forget anytime soon. I wish, right? We still could use that lesson sometimes. And then we get back to building. But before we get back to building, God says to Moses, okay, these are the things, Elah Devarim, these are the things that I want you to say to the people. And Moses is about to write down, construction instructions. But God surprises him and says, don't forget Shabbat. Right? 6 days you shall work, and on the seventh day you will not. No kind of work, no kind of melacha will be done. And I use that word melacha for work because there are different words for work in Hebrew, right? Another word is avodah, which could mean service, but could also mean work or job. You ask somebody, what's your avodah? And they say, well, I'm a plumber, or I'm a butcher, or a baker, or a candlestick maker. But that's another word for work is avodah. But it uses this word melacha that's, not maybe a common word for all kinds of labor or moving things or work in the sense of physics, of like moving mass through space. So we wonder, what is this melacha? It says, don't do melacha, and it attaches the death penalty to it. So we're going to take it kind of seriously, right? If I can get killed for doing a melacha, I really want to know what a melacha is. But that's where it stops. It doesn't say, this is one, this is one, this is one, this is one. It jumps back into the story of the building of the Mishkan. And when it talks about the work of the Mishkan, it uses that word melacha again. And from this particular parsha, and there's some hints elsewhere as well, but from this particular parsha, we learn that the specific things that we set aside in order to protect Shabbat, and that instruction doesn't come till Deuteronomy, Shamor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kodsho, protect the Sabbath day for its holiness. How do we protect the Sabbath day? We refrain from doing things that might impinge on it. What things should we not do that might impinge on it? Vayakhel comes to teach us. So it says, no melacha on Shabbat, and here's a bunch of melachot, like here's a bunch of work things. And so the rabbis derive from this that the things we're not supposed to do, there's a list of 39 things that they associated with building the Mishkan. Things like baking bread, because there was bread as a part of the holy service in the Mishkan. But if you can't bake bread, you also can't prepare the dough. If you can't prepare the dough, you can't grind the wheat. If you can't grind the wheat, you can't pick the wheat. If you can't pick the wheat, you can't plant the wheat. So all these things related to, let's say, produce and agriculture are off the table. And look, at that time, probably a pretty agrarian society, a lot of people's work was farming. And so no farming. Right, no farming, no processing produce in order to make it a finished thing and cooking it so that people can eat it on that day. That's off the table. Other things like preparing textiles, right? Anything associated with preparing textiles, from shearing a sheep to actually weaving things together and all the steps in between, off the table. No creating things out of hides, and that's not just stitching the hides together or writing or marking on the hides. That's where we get the prohibition from writing. No marking on the hides, no erasing things that you've marked or erasing in order to mark new things. But it does, that's where it ends. It starts with no hunting. Somebody asked me today, I heard that Judaism is kind of opposed to hunting all the time. Why does it say no hunting on Shabbat? Well, yes, generally speaking, hunting is kind of off the menu in a traditional observance of Judaism. Not for this reason. So we normally don't hunt unless we have to in order to eat, right? If you're starving to death, you can absolutely hunt in order to preserve your life. In general, we don't consume meat from hunting, because when you hunt an animal, you can't guarantee that that animal is harvested according to other dietary restrictions that we have. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but if you hunt, generally speaking, it's hard to process, harvest and process the animal in a kosher way. It's just difficult. You can do it to save your life, but you can't do it on Shabbat. And now, if you have to hunt to literally save your life on Shabbat, again, the overriding principle is pikuach nefesh dochech Shabbat. Like, you can, in order to save a life, you can supersede or set aside momentarily the restrictions on Shabbat behavior. But it says don't hunt in this context on Shabbat, not because of kashrut, but because hunting is the beginning of the process that leads to having these hides that were used for sort of a waterproof covering, if you will, on the portable sanctuary. And so it lists out all these seemingly picayune things, like really detailed stuff that, I'm not a farmer. I'm going to admit this freely. I am not a farmer. I have never hunted an animal. I know I grew up in Texas and West Virginia, so I was kind of an oddball. I've never hunted an animal. I think I did some weaving one time, just on like a little toy loom in maybe a home ec class or something. I think I did a little bit of weaving, maybe an art class. But other than that, I'm not like an expert weaver. I've never tanned a hide from an animal that I've hunted. So some of these things don't really feel like they're relevant to my life. However, they're there to teach us the difference between, the work in the sense of physics and work in the sense of skilled labor. All of these activities that I've mentioned and everything on that list take skill and involve some sort of either creativity or destruction. And as one of my students pointed out today, and also kind of how we teach it in the Miller Introduction to Judaism class. I'm teaching one of those in Pasadena. Just real quick plug, anybody in the LA area, especially in the East Valley, who wants to take Introduction to Judaism with me, I highly recommend signing up for the Miller Introduction to Judaism program. The East Valley one's being taught in Pasadena by me. It's my absolute favorite class to teach, live anyway. And we have a lot of fun. So check that out. It's intro.aju.edu. Commercial over. And sorry about that, guys. But I'm not, sorry, not sorry. It's actually a wonderful class, and I'd love it if you could join me. But let's focus on this class. But as we teach in that class, and as my student Larry today said, the general things that we don't do on Shabbat are creation and destruction, right? Creating things in the world and destroying things in the world, mostly because the original spirit of Shabbat is out of sufficiency, right? The sense of sufficiency. God created the world in 6 days, according to that narrative in our tradition. And on the seventh day, God rested. God decided the world was good as it was. Didn't need anything else for now. Could wait a day before we added anything or subtracted anything from it. And so that's part of the spirit of Shabbat. But I want to go back to those people who just couldn't wait for God or Moses to come down and speak to them, and so they freaked out and they built a cow. This cow was a product of our insecure relationship to time. And I'm reminded of the teaching of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, wrote this incredible book that I highly recommend to everybody. Now, Rabbi Heschel's writings are philosophical and florid, and I think that's a nice thing to say about writing. It's beautiful writing. Sometimes it's a little dense, a little bit hard to get through, because he was a philosopher trained in Europe, and in addition to being kind of a near Hasidic master, if you will, from his learning as a youth, and a PhD from German universities back in the day. He wrote in a very philosophical style. A lot of his writing is very dense, but this one book I want to recommend is probably the most accessible of his works, and it's short and it's pithy, and it's called The Sabbath. Right? And I think a subtitle of this book, or a grand theme of this book, I think it's maybe the title of the first chapter or something, is A Palace in Time. And so tonight I really want to focus on this concept of time. We needed an idol because we had failed to master the long game, right? We had failed to conquer our sense of time. And so we created something in space, right? Not like outer space, but in 3 dimensions, in extension, in the physical world. We couldn't abide the time of distance between us and God and God's spokesperson, Moses. So we couldn't conquer that time, so we decided to conquer space instead and make a thing. And one of the theses of Rabbi Heschel's book is that whereas other cultures, other civilizations take great pains to dominate space, that is, they build things in space. The Romans built the Colosseum in the physical world. When I say space, again, I'm meaning like 3 dimensions, what the translators of Descartes would call extension. But we build material things inside the perceptible universe of space. The Jewish civilization, to borrow Kaplan's term, doesn't attempt to dominate space as much as it attempts to master time. Where great churches of the Middle Ages and what have you would build these great cathedrals in space, we instead build cathedrals, as Rabbi Heschel says, in time. And Shabbat is one of those cathedrals in time. Rather than marking out space that is ours and then we occupy, and this is sacred space, this is mundane space, church is where holy stuff is done, at home not so much, or in the street not so much. We project our holiness and learn our holiness from time. We build our cathedrals in time, and we do that with the Jewish holidays, with life cycle events when we mark birth and joining the covenant and adulthood at bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah. We mark the time of a wedding. We even mark the time of a divorce. And of course, because everybody gets one of these, we mark the time of death. And our mourning rituals are very time dependent. But more than any of that, and I'll say more frequently than any of that, we build a cathedral in time called Shabbat. And Shabbat, all of the rules about Shabbat don't depend on space necessarily. There's some, spatial things, carrying inside, from a public domain to a private domain, Tachom Shabbat, don't travel so far. But for the most part, what overrides all considerations on Shabbat is time, right? Up to a certain point of time, all of these things are permitted. The time of Shabbat occurs, and all of these things are forbidden for the duration of Shabbat. And then Shabbat passes, and the same activities are then permitted again, right? So the sacred area that we have marked out is not a sacred area in space. It is a sacred area in time. And this Parsha reinforces that by, before it gives us the instructions of this thing that we're supposed to build in space, that is the Mishkan, it says, just in case you were wondering, Shabbat is a thing, right? It says just, and this is like the third time we even, maybe actually the fourth time, maybe we hear about Shabbat. We hear about Shabbat at Genesis, right? That God created the world in 6 days, seventh day, rested, and said, sanctified that day, said this is a good day for people to rest. We hear about it in the story of man, or the manna that comes from heaven, that we can gather the manna for 6 days a week, but we're not supposed to gather the manna on Shabbat. It's not even going to fall on Shabbat. Twice as much will fall on Friday, and we gather up a double portion on Friday so that we don't have to gather any on Shabbat. So that's another mention of Shabbat. Shabbat comes back again in Parashat Yitro, when it's talking about the 10 Commandments, right? One of the top 10 is Shabbat. So we've heard of this Shabbat thing. Why do we need reminding of Shabbat right before we build the Mishkan? And there's a suggestion, I learned it from Nechama Leibowitz, who learned it from other teachers as well, that this is a reminder that our responsibility, our gift, our unique feature of the Jewish people is that we prioritize the sanctity of time over the sanctity of space, also known as the sanctity of stuff, right? Before you enter this holy building project, you may think this is a super important thing to do, and it is. We spent a couple of parshiot talking about the materials and the clothes. Now we're going to have a whole parsha about hiring the general contractor, Bezalel, and making the thing. But before we get going, just so you don't forget, Shabbat comes first. Shabbat, or rather, I don't know what day they started building, actually. I'm sure we could find that out by just counting days in the Torah. But before you start building, just remember, you're not going to build 7 days a week. You're going to build 6 days a week. Shabbat and the principle of Shabbat, the sanctity of that time, supersedes the sanctity of the space. And that's why we learn about Shabbat in this Parsha. Even though we've heard about Shabbat before, we've heard it almost in these exact same words. 6 days a week you'll work. The seventh day you don't. And then this tacks on the capital penalty to that if you do. And people read that either literally or metaphorically. I tend to read it metaphorically because I tell you what, if I couldn't live my life as a free person and set aside a sacred day, then that wouldn't feel much like life to me. So I read that Yamut, that, surely you shall die thing. I don't go around, killing people for Shabbat violations, and God forbid anybody does that to me. But it does feel like less of a life if I don't have Shabbat in it. And this is different. I don't like, I'm not kind of a Jewish particularist, exceptionalist. I don't go around saying, okay, the Jewish people are better than anybody else. I do believe we have a special relationship to God. Other people's do as well, but we have this special relationship to God. But part of my Judaism has never been about we are better than another people. We have a true path and everybody else has a false path. I don't get into too much that kind of talk, but I will call out a uniqueness that Rabbi Heschel calls out. That is, while other civilizations attempt to conquer space, we have made a priority of mastering time. One of our masteries of time, as I mentioned before, is the Jewish tradition of mourning, right? We have, when somebody passes, we have a time constraint there. We bury the body as quickly as we can, and that's out of dignity for the dead person. But then once that's done, we immediately pivot to the living person, and our main job as a community is to comfort that person. And we have an organized way of doing this, which includes things like Shiva. Those first 7 days, we don't expect you to show up for anybody. You stay at home, you dwell in what you need to dwell in, but we're going to come see you. We're going to have Shiva. We're going to have Shiva Minyanim. So if you want to pray the Kaddish, the Kaddish Yatom, the Mourner's Kaddish, you don't need to go to a synagogue. We come to your house and we pray it there. But then we have another level of time, Shloshim, the 30 days following the burial, where it's not exactly like Shiva. You're not expected to be 100%, but you do get to sort of rejoin the world for a little bit. And then we have Yartzeit. If you're mourning your parents, you before Yartzeit, you say Kaddish every day for 11 months. And then once 12 months has passed, we might have an unveiling. That's a common tradition, is that you unveil the headstone at that year mark, but you also begin to say Kaddish on Yartzeit. You go from daily to annually, and then there are 4 times a year. There are 4 times a year where we say some prayers honoring the person who has passed, and that's during Yizkor at Yom Kippur and the 3 pilgrimage festivals. So that's an example of how we sanctify. I was going to say master or conquer, but I think the right word here is sanctify time. And again, other cultures sanctify space. They build cathedrals and churches and pyramids. And not that we don't have any buildings, but we don't have any pyramids either, right? I'll just say that I love Shoal as much as the next guy, and I've seen some beautiful synagogues out there, some really creative uses of architecture. But you can pray anywhere. You don't need to pray in a synagogue. And not, again, that's not unique to us, but when we pray is so much more important than where we pray. I'll say that we pray, that somebody prays is the most important thing. If you're not praying, you should start praying. I'm just saying, I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. It's been a very beneficial thing to me. That you pray, I think, is the first most important thing. But then beyond that, when you pray, morning, afternoon, evening, is so much more important than the space that you pray in. I mean, the people around you are more important than the space. But the primary urge, the obligation of the mitzvot, if that's your bag, is less about the space than it is about the time. And we are time dependent in our lunisolar calendar. I was talking to somebody on the Jew Curious show this week about calling Jews moon people, in the sense that we have Rosh Chodesh. We mark our holidays and things like that by the lunar cycle. So many of our holidays are at the full moon. When the moon is completely dark, that is our new month. That is our new moon. So we have this connection to something greater than ourselves, this sort of celestial marking of time that happens in the universe, and we can do that wherever we are. This focus on time instead of space has saved us more than once. There was a time that we lost our first temple and we went into exile. That could have been game over, right? In ancient Near Eastern societies and other ancient societies, the god that you worshiped was intimately connected to the space of your homeland. Let's say, like, this is the god of Egypt, this is the god of Sumeria, I'm mixing up my time periods here, and our God, the God of Israel, there was a connection to Eretz Yisrael, the special space. However, when we lost that space, when we were exiled from that space, we were able to maintain a connection to God because our God was less about space than about time. And then that exile ended, we went back, and then we were exiled again. The first time was about 50 years. The second time was about 2,000 years. And we've spent more of our time in diaspora than not. We've spent more of our time in exile than not. Maintaining this longing for the connection to Eretz Yisrael. However, and I'm going to go out on a limb here. This is just my opinion. I didn't learn this from anybody else. My hypothesis, I don't know if it's a theory yet, my hypothesis is that we have been able to maintain our connection to God and our connection to each other because of this emphasis on time rather than on space. And there is a passage from this part of the Torah that distinguishes these things. It says, and I've been talking about sort of Jews versus non-Jews. Jews like time, non-Jews like space. But we're not different from anybody. I mean, we're human just like anybody else. It's not so much as a Jewish, non-Jewish difference as it is a human difference between the human and the holy. And we learn this from when and I believe this doesn't come until Pekudei, where Moshe actually assembles the Mishkan and consecrates its use. It says Moses puts together the Mishkan, anoints it, and sanctifies it. Uses the verb Vaikadeshoto. Moses sanctifies. Vaikadesh means sort of to sanctify or set apart or to make or declare holy. Sanctify is kind of a common English word for this. So Moses sanctifies this thing, this element in space, but that's not the first time we've seen the phrase Vaikadeshoto. Moses Vaikadeshoto, the tent, right? The tabernacle, the Mishkan. But the first time we see this phrase, Vaikadeshoto, where somebody sanctifies something, is when God talks about Shabbat in Breshit, in the beginning of, I think, chapter 2 of Genesis. Vayvarek Elokim et Yom HaShvi'i Vaikadeshoto. God blessed the Sabbath day and sanctified it and made it holy. And so Nechama Leibovitz points out that when we sanctify things, like our draw is to things that we can see, things that we can touch, hence the whole golden cow story. The human draw is to sanctify space, extension, matter. What God does is sanctifies time. And so insofar as we are able to sanctify time, we are expressing godliness. We are created in the image of God. We don't always act like God would act. I'm just going to confess that right now. Sorry, everybody. Just the way it is. But every once in a while we can try. Every once in a while we can really stretch our legs, flex our muscles, use our godlike capacity for reason and our godlike capacity for empathy, and try. And so when we are at our best, we are not sanctifying space or stuff, we are sanctifying time. And I think that's the lesson of Parashat Vayakhel. I know we've talked about a lot of different stuff tonight because there's a lot of different stuff that goes into Shabbat. People have a lot of questions about the kind of particular aspects of Shabbat. But I wanted to draw out this distinction first because Shabbat is important to us, and I wanted you to see that an important element of how we do Shabbat comes from this week's Parsha. I love it when I run into stuff at the Torah that's familiar. Like, okay, why do we do this strange thing? Oh, it's in this week's reading. Why do we do Shabbat the way we do Shabbat? It's because of the rabbis and the sages' interpretation of this week's reading. But we begin this week's reading with a reminder that holy time supersedes anything in holy space. And the extent to which we emulate and imitate that is the extent to which we exercise our full capacity of being B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And so I'll invite you as you go into Shabbat pretty soon. It's Thursday night when I'm talking about this. If it comes out on the podcast, it'll come out on perhaps on sorry about that. It's Wednesday night. When this comes out on the podcast, it'll be Thursday morning. We got still a little bit of time left before Shabbat, so you can prepare. But I want you to think about not the stuff of Shabbat. Candles are nice. Wine is nice. Challah is nice. Not the stuff of Shabbat, not even necessarily the place of Shabbat, whether you spend your Shabbat at home or in a synagogue or on the beach, or you do you. But I want you to think about the time of Shabbat. I want you to think about it sort of begins on its own schedule and ends on its own schedule, and we can either sanctify that brief sliver of schedule, or we could let it pass into mundaneness. And so my blessing for you, my encouragement to you this week, is to be very sensitive to the time of when Shabbat begins, when Shabbat ends, and how in that bubble of time you can take full advantage of it. You can make it special wherever you are with whatever you have. That's my lesson from Pekudei for this week. I'm going to go in. I've seen some activity in the chat, so we'll see if people have particular questions about this. I see some people giving a shout out to Rabbi Heschel. We read Rabbi Heschel in the 70s. He was writing well before that, and well after that. He's no longer with us. Let's see. We have Daniela. We have Kathy. We have Teresa. Have been here from the beginning. I saw a new friend CJ in there. I see Alexandria, Virginia. I'm going to confess some ignorance. I don't know if that is your name or where you're from. I used to live in Springfield, Virginia, in Fairfax County, and work in D.C., so I'm familiar with Alexandria, Virginia. But if that's your name, please correct me so I'm not, doesn't sound like I'm making fun of you, God forbid. So people are talking about Professor Wertheimer's interview on the podcast today. It says that seems like... is that why Shabbat was mentioned first? Because it's more important than the tabernacle. That's my impression. That's the opinion of some rabbis. It's the smichut parshiot of Shabbat and the work of the tabernacle is what teaches us that the work we're not supposed to do is related to the tabernacle. But that's Nechama Leibovitz and other people's teaching that Shabbat precedes the work of the tabernacle, lest we think that the tabernacle or the Mishkan is more important than Shabbat. So that's the point that they're making that I'm kind of passing on to you. See our friend Lexi from New Zealand, I believe, and I'm not seeing any questions necessarily. I'm seeing a flower. I'm seeing a shamrock. We do have the St. Patrick's Day coming up. Not necessarily endorsing non-Jewish holidays, but one of my sister's birthdays on St. Patrick's Day, so I'm very familiar with it. So listen, thank you everybody for learning this with me tonight. I really appreciate your presence. I appreciate the people showing up to learn, the shout outs we're getting. I appreciate people talking to each other. And so thank you for learning this Torah with me tonight. I'm going to confess an error that I made. Often when you want to learn Torah together, people precede it with a blessing. And so I forgot to do that. Thank you for Kathy's always reminding me. I get so excited about this stuff, I jump into it without saying the blessing for the mitzvah. So I'm going to say it now. There's a custom that if you forget the blessing in its time, you can say it as soon as you remember to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And so that's the blessing that we bless God, source of all of our blessings, who guides our life, who gives us mitzvot, commandments, in order to uplift our lives, including, and I'm going to say especially, I'm a little bit biased, the commandment of studying Torah. So thank you all for learning this week. So thank you all for learning this with me this evening, and I really appreciate it. Stay tuned for more episodes of the Jew Curious Show podcast. We're going to have another live session tomorrow. Nothing on Friday, nothing on Saturday, Nothing on Sunday. I'm going to be out of town. My sister, the other sister, is getting married, and so I'm going to be out of pocket for a few days. But I've really appreciated doing all the learning that we've been doing together this week. Thank you, heroes, and until next time, peace.